This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, January the 29th. On this episode of the Word, Wheat Pete is in Newfoundland. Some fun there, I'll tell you. Want to talk about small gains. Wow, really incredible stuff. Rotational tillage. There has been questions come in sporadically about rotational tillage. It triggered me to do some we'll have that discussion, and then we'll have fun with fertility. Lots of questions coming in about that. Let's go! Yes, so Wheat Pete is in Newfoundland, and thank you to the Newfoundland Federation of Agriculture for having me out here. This is a sad statement. You all know that Wheat Pete is not a young man. This is the first time that I have ever made it to Newfoundland, and I am a proud Canadian, and I like to get across Canada. So huge thanks for having me out here. I got to kick off their conference, and so one of the things that we wanted to talk about was plot work and gaining yield and climate impacts and a whole bunch of those things. But the one thing that always astounds me whenever growers come up to me, they're like so often, the first question is, "Hey Pete, what's the secret sauce? What's the next big thing in agriculture? What's going to make me get 250 bushel corn versus 200 bushel corn? Where's the big gains?" Oh my gosh, there just are no real big gains to be had. If there were, it means we've been doing everything wrong. Now, once in a while, something comes along like sulphur, and we will talk briefly again about sulphur at the end of this episode, where you can, in certain situations, see significant gains. Our nitrogen by fungicide synergy in wheat, that was one of the big wins where we did get 20 bushel yield gains, and so the odd home run exists. But if you are always looking for the secret sauce, the next home run, you will actually slip the clutch on everything else and it will fall apart. And what you really need to look for is the 1% gains, that 1 bushel yield gain, that 2 bushel yield gain, that little bit better tillage perhaps, or better fertilizer placement, or just tweaking that nitrogen rate or that phosphorus rate, because it's those small gains that add up over time to actually give you the win. And here's the classic story of how that works. Sir Dave Brailsford took on the UK cycling team, coaching the UK cycling team in 2002. Before 2002, the UK cycling team had won 1 gold medal at the Olympics in 76 years. They were just not competitors. And Sir Dave just said, let's look at the small things. Let's see where we can make small gains. And they studied everything to the point that they found the van that they traveled in had dust on the floor. The dust on the floor was getting into or on the bikes that they were carrying in the back of that van, and when they lubricated the chains, that dust, even though the chains were lubricated, the dust was incorporated, and it was actually having a negative impact on how easily those chains went around when they cycled. And it was a very small thing. But that, along with nutrition, along with sleeping, he found all these small gains to continuously improve. And in 2008, 6 years later, the UK cycling team won 7 out of 10 available gold medals. So just phenomenal. You really do have to sweat get the small stuff, find those small gains, because they will drive things much better than you expect. And if you're always looking for the secret sauce, if you're always coming up to Wheat Pete and saying, Pete, man, what's the silver bullet? What's going to get me the big gain? Man, they are few and far between. And trust me, as soon as we find out about them, Wheat Pete's going to talk about it on the Word, and everybody's going to be doing it. So the fine-tuning efficiencies really do make a huge difference. Cool. So that's my fun here on the Rock. Now let's move back to the drainage conference. I was at the drainage conference last week, heard a great speaker, Ron the Weatherman, and it really does drive home this point that, wow, the times, they are a-changing. We are getting more heat. Rainfall is intensifying. So one of the things that Ron talked about was that the Toronto area has had 6 100-year storms since 2005. So let me put that in perspective. A 100-year storm is a storm where the amount of rainfall that falls should only happen once in 100 years. And so when we size different things, we will often say it's sized for a 1 in 10-year storm. So that's the amount of water it can handle. If we get more water, like a 1 in 25-year storm, then that system won't handle that much water. And often we size things for a 1 in 25 or a 1 in 50-year storm. Toronto has had 6 1 in 100-year storms in the last 20 years. That's crazy. You would expect one storm, and then you wouldn't have one for another, it's never 99 years, but it's that kind of a concept, and you just go, yowzers. Yeah, things are definitely changing, and we need to adapt to the change. And at the conference, we also talked about Jack Miner, a drainage person from back in the early 1900s, also a conservationist. But Jack wrote a poem, and I just loved this poem. I'm going to read it to you. If your land is too wet and you're burdened with debt and encumbrances begin to accrue, obey nature's laws by removing the cause, drain your farm or it will drain you. It just makes me laugh. Absolutely. All right, I want to move on and talk about real stuff. First up, last episode, I talked about buckwheat being baloney. So I immediately get some feedback. So I do think that there's very little scientific support for the fact that buckwheat solubilizes phosphorus. Man, lots of crops solubilize phosphorus. Buckwheat is mycorrhizal, not as mycorrhizal as flax, I don't think. So if anything probably solubilizes phosphorus, it's flax. But regardless, the comment was, well, Pete, wait a minute. It may not solubilize phosphorus, but don't forget the work by Aaron Mills out of AAFC in Prince Edward Island. Buckwheat, as a cover crop, has a very good control level on wireworm, and that you just go, yep, 100%. So buckwheat on wireworm is not baloney. Buckwheat on phosphorus, maybe so. Okay, I want to move on. I want to talk about rotational tillage. So this has come up a lot, and people will say, in fact, Brian Arnell at the Southwest Ag Conference said in Oklahoma, they plow once every 15 years. I think I may have talked about this on a previous episode. They plow once every 15 years because in Oklahoma, dry climate, and they get nutrient stratification at the surface, and so they will plow that to get the nutrients down deeper. In a dry climate, gets dry when the crop is growing. The nutrients at the surface, no moisture, so they're stratified. They can't be accessed. So by plowing them, getting them deeper where the moisture is, they become more available when the plant needs them. They do then, because Oklahoma, man, wind blows, so they immediately plant wheat or some cereal crop to cover that soil, to stabilize that soil. And what they've found is that tillage, 1 year in 15, has almost no negative impact on the health of their soils. And there's some good work out of Michigan State as well that would suggest that. What really kind of twigged me to talk about this was our own Lindsay Smith here at Real Agriculture sent me an article about Simon Cowell, who farms in Essex, the UK. So this is not Simon Cowell, the TV Simon Cowell. This is a farmer. And he's been no-till for over 20 years. He's heavy clay soil. He went to no-till because his soil was in such bad health that he couldn't make a seed bed. It would come up in lumps, and it was just becoming impossible. And no-till on that heavy clay soil revolutionized how he farmed. It just made farming so much better, and so it really was a big win. But now his yields have sort of stalled out, and he actually went and he moldboard plowed a couple of fields or parts of fields to see, will that help stimulate another bump in the yield? So just a whole bunch of things about that I want to chat about. One thing is that he said in that 20 years of no-till, he had increased his organic matter from 3.5 to 8%. Okay, whoa, stop, not possible. You just, like, to get a 4% increase in soil organic matter is almost impossible. Now, I have to be careful because he did say that he had part of the way he had gotten there was by adding a lot of compost. And so if you add enough compost, maybe, my question immediately becomes, where do you get that much compost? But okay, but if you're just no-tilling, that is not going to increase your organic matter that much. There's just no way. But what really was interesting in the article was that he said it had gotten to that level and it was no longer increasing, and he felt that he had hit carbon saturation. And so this actually occurs when you get to that point where you've built your soil carbon up to a level where the breakdown is so fast that it matches the amount of carbon that you're adding. And so in nature, if you go back to the prairie, the tall grass prairies, they were at carbon saturation because they were breaking down organic matter as quickly as they were building organic matter. And that just happens in climax vegetation. Typically, as soon as we go to any tillage, we drop that equilibrium carbon content. So it's carbon saturation, but it's really a carbon equilibrium where the amount of return and the amount of breakdown match. As soon as you go to tillage, that level drops. So it will be interesting in Simon's case. Almost for sure, his carbon level will drop. But one of the more interesting things he did talk about was the fact that his yields had plateaued, and he really wondered if it wasn't because some of the phytotoxic materials in the residue, his crop residue, had built up so much. And there's lots of evidence that, the quintessential study is autotoxicity in alfalfa. You all know, we've talked about it here, that if you have a good alfalfa stand and you say, I want some new alfalfa plants, you put new alfalfa seed there, it doesn't germinate, because the existing alfalfa plants exude a compound out of their roots which prevents that new alfalfa seed from germinating. By the way, it doesn't prevent the dandelions from germinating, but it does prevent the alfalfa seed from germinating. We've talked lots about phytotoxicity of cereal rye on the following corn crop. So these things do exist, and he was really wondering if those phytotoxic chemicals were just there in high enough quantities. They last a long time in clay soils because clay soils don't break things down as quickly. They're tighter. The biological activity is less. And so by diluting those phytotoxic chemicals with that tillage, he's hoping that he can get that yield increase. So the other thing that he did not talk about, but man, if he built up to 8% organic matter and he does tillage once, he will absolutely get a big boost in yield the next year because he's aerated the soil. He's going to get some of that organic matter that he's at carbon saturation. It's going to release nitrogen. It's going to release sulphur. It's going to release potash. All of those nutrients that the crop needs because we've added air into the soil. So he will see a yield boost. That's almost a guarantee. But the trick is, how long does it last? And don't forget that the reason he went to no-till in the first place is because his soil structure was so bad by being beat up by tillage upon tillage upon tillage. How long does it take him to get back there? He did say that after 20 years of no-till, he plowed the soil, and it was a totally different soil than it had been 20 years ago. But this whole concept of occasional rotational tillage is not necessarily all bad, as long as I think we do it understanding why we're doing it and trying to maximize the benefit without going back to Simon's original situation where his soil was so beat up that he couldn't get it to make a seed bed at all. All right, I want to move on. I'm going to talk about fertility. So some cool numbers out of the yen and on phosphorus placement with wheat. Now, be careful with this, because you know that wheat peat is the poster child for seed-placed phosphorus on wheat. So I wouldn't talk about these numbers if I didn't like them. Well, actually, it's not true. I would talk about them if I didn't like them. But you always have to remember with any yen data, so this is the yield enhancement network, that they are not side-by-side comparisons. So they are just trends. But I'll give you the numbers. So there is a few people in the yen that do what is called mid-row banding. All the people in Western Canada are saying, what do you have to explain mid-row banding? Most people in Eastern Ontario, in Eastern Canada, on the eastern seaboard of the U.S., we don't do mid-row banding. So that's where you will have 10-inch rows, and you plant the wheat in 10-inch rows, and you put a band of fertilizer mid-row between each pair of rows, so it's 5 inches away or something like that. With the European drills, sometimes it's only 2.5 inches away, and so some of this mid-row banding may be just 2.5 inches away. But the yield on the mid-row banded starter phosphorus was 101 bushels per acre on average. Broadcast phosphorus, 111 bushels per acre. Broadcast and incorporated phosphorus, 113. So it looks like the incorporation helped a little bit, a trend only, but interesting. The in-furrow phosphorus. Now, you know this number is going to be bigger because Pete is just smiling. The in-furrow phosphorus, 121 bushels per acre. Man, wheat loves phosphorus, and it just loves it early. Just do it. It's just the way that it is. On that note, Kevin's saying, all right, Pete, a 1-year rental. We know we're only going to have it for 1 year. It was soybeans last year. We're going back to soybeans. This is Essex County in Ontario, and it's good ground, but we're only going to have it for 1 year. The most profitable thing to do is to grow soybeans again. What foliar fertilizer can I apply to make the crop work? Because I'm only going to have it this year. Why would I apply a broadcast dry fertilizer? Like, it just doesn't make sense. You know, it's really interesting, Kevin, but it is just impossible. It's simply impossible. And we had this discussion as well on Tech Talk Tuesday, on Tuesday night with the big three, corn, soybeans, and wheat, trying to get yields higher, looking at macronutrients, so phosphorus and potash, nitrogen. When you look at macronutrients, trying to meet that need with foliar fertilizers simply is not possible. It does not work. Totally different with manganese, with micronutrients, because they need so little, it can work. With macronutrients, it just simply does not work. And so in your situation, Kevin, 1 year rental, soys on soys, man, the best thing you can do is to broadcast replacement values. So, you know, kind of that 40 pounds of phosphorus, something in that range, and maybe 55, 60 pounds of potash actual. And so if you do that, that will give you the biggest bang for the buck. And by the way, Kevin, and I hate to say this, but in this situation, if you can get a soil test, because if that soil test is pretty medium or high, even the broadcast fertilizer is not going to pay. If it's low, it will pay. Maybe on those heavy clays, it pays even at medium. If it's a high soil test, yeah, just grow the soybeans. Have a nice day. And I feel for the next guy that rents that particular field. On that note, Dwayne from Saskatchewan saying, Pete, how come foliar sugars don't work on wheat and canola? And Dwayne, my question would be, well, foliar sugars, what crops do they really work on? Because what is the philosophy behind that sugar? It's supposed to stimulate biological activity, but what the plant is trying to do is make sugar. It takes the sunlight, it takes the carbon dioxide, it takes the water, it makes sugar. So how is spraying a foliar sugar really going to boost that plant, other than it'll take that and hopefully assimilate it into the plant itself? It's a bit of a quandary for me from that perspective. But the reason that they don't work well on wheat and canola is because leaves are not designed to take up sugar. In the natural environment, there is not sugar in the air. And the leaves evolved to take the things the plant needed up out of the air that were in the air. So it gets really tough to get something like a sugar into that plant to boost it. And it makes perfect sense to me that they just don't work, that you have not had success from that perspective. Okay, finish up quickly on sulfur. Jeff saying, Peter, you're talking about 20 pounds of sulfur on the soybeans. Now, we talked about this on Tech Talk Tuesday. And so to give you the skinny, if you weren't able to catch Tech Talk Tuesday, we don't record them. Hopefully everybody is a participant with the Ontario Ag Conference and gets the ability to join if you can. But we had Shaun Castile on soybeans, we had Dave Hooker on wheat, we had Dan Quinn on corn, also Horst Bonner, Greg Stewart. And at the end of the night, I said, come on, boys, what is the sulfur rate? Because everybody seemed to think we need sulfur, and they all said 20 pounds. 20 pounds on corn, 20 pounds on wheat, 20 pounds on soybeans. And I said, oh, no way. Like, it's too much. And so when push came to shove, the actual rate is 10 pounds. And by the way, you only need more than 10 pounds if you get into a situation where you are going to lose that sulfur. The soybean story, Jeff, in your situation, you're already putting on 8 pounds in your starter fertilizer. You're using MAP, AMS, and KMag. So 8 pounds is pretty close to 10 pounds. Do we need to change? But I will say that's a hot blend to put right with the seed. 25 of MAP, 10 of AMS, 25 of KMag. If you really want to shift that, the salt index of AMS is 88. The salt index of gypsum is 8. So you could take out 10 pounds of ammonium sulfate, you could put back in 100 pounds of gypsum, and you would have the same salt index. So if you've been getting away with what you did before, it shouldn't change that. You would bump your sulfur right up to the 20 pounds. The only downside is you're going to put on a lot more fertilizer through that drill. And do you get that yield gain out of that added sulfur? The other thing on sulfur on soybeans that was quite clear, the only hope you have for response on soybeans is if you are planting extra early or you're on sand soils. Soybeans, a lot of soybeans are not going to respond. We've talked about this almost too much, and I want to pull you back because Wheat Pete did a trial on his soybeans last year with sulfur. They were planted, I don't know, the 10th of May, something like that. The yield increase was the big fat 0. And in many cases, if you're planting normal time frame, you're on a loam soil type, you are not going to see response to sulfur. And I will maybe discuss more on that if people ask more questions. But for now, I am out of time. That's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, the 29th of January. Hey, keep the questions, the comments coming. And St. John's, Newfoundland, please have me back, but maybe in August. We'll talk to you next week. Bye now.